Hey class, this week we're going to be covering bioenergetics and exercise training. This is always a very kind of fun, exciting, at the same time overwhelming aspect of exercise physiology. And we'll get into it, but essentially we're going to be talking about how energy is generated during during rest. I mean, it's always on, but certainly in exercise, and depending on the intensity of the exercise, excuse me, it's going to dictate the energy systems that are going to be utilized, and we'll identify these energy systems. And if we move on here to the next slide, you will see I want you to be able to explain the basic energy systems available to supply ATP, adenosine triphosphate, during exercise. Understand lactate accumulation and metabolic acidosis and cellular manifestations of fatigue. So, when do you get tired? Why do you get tired while doing certain types of exercise? And then identify patterns of substrate depletion and repletion during various exercise intensities. So, what's the cause of your inability to continue on with exercise will be determined by the availability of certain compounds and essentially chemicals in your body, in your bloodstream, and then describe the bioenergetic factors that limit exercise performance. So you're going to see here below me this concept of the different energy systems. And the first thing I want you to be able to do, a couple more things and I'll talk about this, but so also want you to be able to develop training programs that demonstrate metabolic specificity in training, right? So this now sort of opens up some understanding of how might I tweak my exercise program using sets, reps, rest, etc., the variables that we can manipulate, load, intensity, and then explain the metabolic demands of and recover from interval training, high intensity interval training, and combination training to optimize work to rest ratio. So we'll get into a little bit of training stuff out of this, which I think brings it to life, makes it a little bit more exciting. What I was saying before is below me is going to be what is essentially the most basic energy system. Again, what we call bioenergetics, the energy systems of biological systems so human beings. And you're going to see that we've got three: the red line, the blue line, and the green line. And we're going to identify those here shortly. But you notice that they all turn on at the same time, but they all turn on at different intensities and peak at different time based on seconds and ultimately minutes at the lower axis. So let's get into this. All right. So a couple key terms that we need to understand. That concept of bioenergetics, which I just explained, which is essentially the flow of energy in a biological system, the conversion of macronutrients, so think carbs, proteins, and fats, into biologically usable forms of energy. So, how do we derive energy out of that? Catabolism is going to be the breakdown of large molecules into smaller molecules associated with the release of energy. And then anabolism is going to be the opposite of that. It's going to be the synthesis of larger molecules from smaller molecules and can be accomplished using energy released from the previously stated catabolic reactions. Exergonic reactions are going to be energy releasing reactions that are generally catabolic. So they're going to be muscle or breakdown or breaking bigger to smaller structures down. Endergonic reactions are going to require energy and include anabolic processes and the contraction of muscle. So there's going to be an aspect of muscular contraction there. Metabolism, we've all heard of that one, is the total of all the catabolic and exergonic and anabolic or endergonic reactions in a biological system. So it's really the accumulation of all of the things, the chemical reactions that are happening, the energy that it takes to maintain, and ultimately whether or not you have enough of that energy through the fuel source, which is food, which is going to be carbs, proteins, and fats, will determine really ultimately weight loss. If you're consistently below what you need, you're going to lose weight. If you're consistently above what you need, you're going to gain weight. And those metabolic functions also become part of the energy equation that we have to factor in when we're actually looking at weight gain and weight loss. Adenosine triphosphate, ATP. So we're going to have you go back to biology here, human biology anyway, and it allows the transfer of energy from exergonic to endergonic reactions. So we'll kind of talk about ATP in a little bit and how it functions and how it breaks down and how it reconstitutes. And then I added this one in here because it does come up. It's this concept called a rate limiting step is a reaction step that controls the rate of a series of biochemical reactions. So whatever the least minimal requirement of a particular reaction, substrate, energy source, if you don't have it, it can prevent the ability of your body to continue on using an energy system. And we'll kind of look at that a little bit. All right, so we're going to talk a little chemistry here, and I don't want to scare anyone, but it is what it is. The goal here is just to give you a high level overview, but really to look at the functionality, the chemical and the physiological things that are happening in the body to really appreciate. Ultimately, the end of the day is to appreciate. There is no expectation that you're going to memorize this. And in fact, what happens in a lot of upper division exercise phys courses is you do have to memorize these long formulas or these long chemical reactions that happen that generate energy. So I'm not going to make you do that. I never had to memorize them because they were always written on somewhere where you could find them. And it doesn't really honestly help you from a practical application perspective to have this thing memorized. It's super cool. I'm always impressed when someone has the Krebs cycle or the electron chain transport memorized. It's really, really cool. But it's not necessary to understand what's happening and why to be able to explain really in just general terminology to a regular person or athlete, patient or client, excuse me, what's happening in their body from a bioenergetic perspective. All right, so the first thing we're going to see here, and we're going to blow up, so I know it's small right now, but it will blow up on the next slide. You're going to see A, B, and C, this process, right? So first, the chemical structure of ATP molecule, including adenosine, which is basically adenine and ribose in a triphosphate group in locations of the high energy chemical bonds. And we'll look at this again. I'll show you this in a little bigger. The hydrolysis of ATP breaks the terminal phosphate bond. So that's what you're going to see here in the second. The one below me. Wish I had a pointer on here. That's the only downside when I'm recording these. I can't really point this out, but I'll talk you through it. So the middle one, you see that little energy burst because a phosphate is broken off. And then the hydrolysis of ADP breaks the terminal phosphate bond and releases that energy and leaves to AMP. So you're going to see that a third break in our adenosine monophosphate. Now, let's look at this a little bit bigger. So you see the very, very tippity top, ATP. You see the adenosine and the ribose at the top. That's your adenine, which makes your adenosine when the ribose is combined. And then we have high energy bonds holding three phosphates together. And you can see under the yellow portion, it says triphosphate. And then what happens is because of energy requirements, I need to go sprint. All of a sudden, we cleave off one of the phosphates and that releases energy. You see that there in the second level. And we still have two phosphates there. So you see that now turns from adenosine triphosphate into adenosine diphosphate. And then there's some water release too. So or water is sort of required as part of this. And then we do it again one more time and we might get another little burst of energy and we now have adenosine monophosphate, a single phosphate attached to that adenosine molecule. Now, the three energy systems are called the phosphagen system, the glycolysis system, or sometimes called the glycolytic system, and then the oxidative system. So let's look at the chart here. You see the number one, the phosphagen system, the PC at the very tippity top. It's in red. It says ATP PC. Stands for phosphate creatine phosphate, or PC. And we'll talk about creatine in a little bit. And then we see in blue glycolysis, or yep. And then we have, I think that's it's French underneath. And then the very bottom three, I guess I ripped this from a French page, so so it is what it is. The third green line is the oxidative system. Now, what I want you to focus on is look at, on the left axis, you see energy, and on the right axis, you see time. So we're going over to the right, we're going time, and then vertically, we're going to look at energy. So the most amount of energy that we get really when we first initiate any kind of, let's say we go for a sprint, the phosphagen system, the ATP-PC system, is the one that is firing, but it only goes, you start to see it drops dramatically right around 15 seconds, and probably by the 30-second mark, it's like out of gas. But that's okay, because you have these other systems that are primed up. They just don't operate quickly right out of the gate. So the next system to sort of pick up where the creatine phosphate system is, or the phosphagen system is sort of losing steam, is the glycolysis system. So you see that's a little slower of a ramp, and then that really peaks at about 30 seconds, and then it sort of drops out towards 60 seconds, and it's still producing in the background a little bit. But if you're going to be, let's say I was sprinting here, I'm trying to sprint maximal effort. If you ever try this, just go to a field and sprint as hard as you can, and set your stopwatch. You're going to see that, and your conditioning is going to determine this too, but you'll start to see probably at around 10, 15 seconds, you're going to start to slow down. Right now, the glycolysis is turning on, and then around 30 seconds, you're going to start really, really breathing. And in fact, you could hold your breath through the first energy system because you don't need any oxygen. Glycolysis doesn't need any oxygen, but we're going to get into slow and fast. And then a slow glycolysis, eventually you're going to need more oxygen. So what happens is the aerobic system starting to ramp up, and aerobic means air. So you're using oxygen to generate some energy, and that's why it's a slow ramp there. And then it takes a little bit more time. And at that point, your let's say power output's going to be decreased. So you could not maintain a sprint by 60 seconds. It's physically exercise physiologically impossible to maintain a full bore sprint for 60 seconds because a whole bunch of chemical reactions are happening. You're just not able to sustain it. And we'll look at that here shortly. All right, so let's talk about the phosphagen system. That's our first one here, and let's focus on the red line. It primarily is going to provide ATP for short-term, high-intensity activities. So resistance training, strength training, Olympic weightlifting, powerlifting, sprinting, and is active at the start of all exercise regardless of intensity. So it always turns on, even if I'm starting slow, you're going to have ATP, PC, or the phosphagen system kind of there turned on. It just depends on how much of it you need. So what happens is this concept of creatine kinase catalyzes the synthesis of ATP from creatine phosphate and ADP. And we'll look at that in a second. You're hearing that term creatine. I'm going to talk to you about supplementing with creatine in a minute, so I don't want you to get ahead of yourself. But absolutely, this is where creatine becomes really, really important, in particular for resistance training, because it's the short energy system that creatine has a direct impact on. And I have a good demonstration of that, or visual demonstration, so you can understand it. All right, so the phosphagen system, it's primarily going to use ATP that's already stored in the blood. You can't store enough ATP for exercise, so you have a certain amount in your bloodstream. That's what gets us moving around all day. But you know, and we need that for basic cellular function. But when we start exercising, we can't produce enough with our phosphagen system. That's why those other systems sort of ramp up and turn on, and they produce more ATP than the phosphagen system does initially. But the phosphagen is always on; it's always there. It's always you're able to generate energy from it. It's going to use creatine kinase, which is basically a chemical grouping reaction to maintain the concentration of ATP in your bloodstream. The phosphagen system replenishes ATP rapidly, and how quickly? So that's the question. So let's say I squat heavy. Let's do 5 reps. So the load is going to be, 90% or 87.5%. Let's just say 90% of my 1 rep max. So that'd be 4 reps. Um, that's heavy weight, right? So what's going to happen? I'm going to be really, really tired. So I use this example of this guy on the bench up here, right? He's just sitting there. And everyone knows on International Bench Press Day on Mondays, what happens? Everyone's just sitting around on the bench, sitting there waiting for minutes and minutes and minutes. And what they're basically doing is fully reconstituting ATP from adenosine diphosphate, and we'll look at this in a second. And they're getting rest. So if you want to maximally restore, you would probably want to rest up to 5 minutes. The NSCA says anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes will allow you to replenish your ATP, but it's also going to depend on your conditioning and your readily available phosphate that's floating around your bloodstream. So now that's International Bench Press Day on Monday, right? Now I do want to point out the guy down here on the lower, this is my bone to pick. So I'm telling everyone, don't do hip thrusts on my bench press. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Find a bench, go somewhere else. I don't care what it is, but don't do it on my bench press. I can't tell you how many times I go to the gym and I see people, and it's usually women, but I could not find a female picture online, but it's always women, and they're doing hip thrusts on my bench press, and I'm sitting there just pacing the floor, being like, "Get off my bench press! That's not what that's for." So be mindful. Be mindful in the gym. I really would appreciate that. Okay, moving forward. So that's your gym etiquette 101 lesson for the day. There might be some others here. I don't know. All right. So what do we have next? We have the phosphagen system, and we can see how it operates. So let's look at this. At the top, you see adenosine triphosphate and some water, and then you see on the right-hand side, we use it, and we see one of those phosphates break off. So we see that inorganic phosphate floating around, and what we have left is adenosine diphosphate. You see 2 phosphates attached there, the 2 P's in yellow. And then we wait a little bit, and then that free phosphate starts to float around. We have other free phosphates floating around in our bloodstream. And then it reconstitutes eventually within 2 to 5 minutes. We're going to get some ATP built back from that ADP. But the law of mass action states that the concentrations or the reactants or products or both in solution will drive the direction of the reaction. So if you've blown through all your ATP, right, you don't have any more, very little. You still have some because you have to function, but you can't recruit nearly as much anymore. And the weight is heavy enough where it's not like you can do, 15 seconds of repetitions or greater, right? So think about going for a sprint. You could sprint a little bit longer, but eventually what's going to happen is you're going to run out of ATP, and then your body's going to slow down, and either you're going to stop if all you're doing is sprinting, or let's say bench pressing, you're going to wait, and then we're going to get that reaction the other way. So it's sort of like a natural process, but time becomes an essential component to this whole process in order for it to reconstitute into ATP. Now, here's the question. So how does creatine work? Creatine monohydrate is, the basic term for that supplement that maybe you've heard, the white powder. It's been marketed this, all this micronized and super delivery, and it's in a drink and Okay, all of the supplement industry is mostly full of BS. However, creatine is the most researched supplement in the history. In the history of supplements ever, it is the most researched supplement, and it absolutely works for resistance training. It doesn't work for cardiovascular stuff because you're using a different energy system, and creatine is essentially short for creatine phosphate, CP. So we sometimes say the CP system, the phosphagen system, because it's creatine phosphate is part of that. So here you have, let's look at that same model, adenosine triphosphate. You lose energy, you need energy, so you're going to crack off a inorganic or a phosphate from that. So now it becomes inorganic. It's not doing anything. It's floating around. Energy is released. And then you're just going to wait until your body can figure out, just reattract another phosphate and put it back into ATP. But what if I take creatine phosphate and I have extra phosphate in my bloodstream? That's unique because now what happens is I've been consuming extra phosphate because that's what creatine is, creatine phosphate, CP, and I have higher saturations of phosphate in my bloodstream. So, what is that going to do to ADP? It's going to make it more readily convert into ATP faster. Now, if I can convert into energy faster, I can work harder, I can recover more quickly in the midst of a training session, like resistance training session, and I can go harder. Well, if I can go harder, meaning I can work harder, that means I can get more output from my lifting session, which in turn can help me to get stronger, which can in turn help me to get more muscular. Now, the one thing is you have to consume more water because you have more phosphate in the system. So it's make sure you're hydrated. But the research is very clear. Creatine phosphate works really well. You don't need anything fancy. Just get the powder. That's all you need, and you consume five. It's usually 5 milligrams. You know, a little scoop. Put it in your protein shake or whatever you're taking, and have it daily when you're while you're training. You don't need to load like there's something they used to say. Oh, you got to take 25 grams for 5 days, and then you can go to 5 grams. No, you just take 5 grams. It bang for buck. The powder is the cheapest. It's the least expensive. So if you're looking for a supplement and you do a lot of resistance training, this is something that can really really help you. Again, it doesn't do anything for cardiovascular endurance training because the energy systems that are working there don't take advantage of the free phosphates situation floating around. It's only the in the phosphagen system. And I want to be very clear, the phosphagen system doesn't need any oxygen. The other two energy systems and the glycolytic system starts to ramp up oxygen. That's when you start breathing. And then the oxidative system, the third one, is going to use the most amount of oxygen and fat to turn that, and sometimes protein to turn into energy. So creatine phosphate can be really, really powerful especially if you're doing a lot of, specifically if you're doing a lot of resistance training. All right, next we're going to move into glycolysis. So now we're going to move into the blue dotted line there. And glycolysis is going to be the breakdown of carbohydrates, either glycogen stored in the muscles or glucose delivered in the bloodstream to resynthesize ATP. So what is glucose? Glucose is a macronutrient. There's some dates there. Looks like some dried fruit as well. And it's really basically, it's a broken down form of sugar. Sugar is a slightly more complex version of glucose. Eventually, if I ate a candy bar, it would break right all down into glucose. And I would keep my blood sugar kind of normalized. Anything extra that I didn't need would turn into fat, be stored as fat. But your muscles also store glycogen, which is another carbohydrate source that can be stored in muscles. And so we'll talk a little bit about post-workout, how you need to replenish glycogen stores in particular because you've depleted them and you need that. And that's one of the reasons why we actually need more carbs post-workout than we need protein. We'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so this gets a little more complicated, so hang on. All right. So we've got this glycolysis chemical reaction, and that's it right there. Multiple steps, but you're going to see. I want you to look at it for a second, and you're going to see a couple things happening. Look at all the ATP that's sort of breaking. You see the little kind of explosions of ATP. So there's a little bit more action. ADP is still there, right? ATP turns into ADP. And then we have NAD plus and NADH, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. So these are all become fancy terms that sort of make up this system. And let's look at this on a little bit bigger scale. You're going to see there's a couple pathways here. So at the very bottom, you see lactate. You see above that, you see pyruvate. And then in the center, you see the Krebs cycle. It's its own little energy system. And then you see pyruvate. Pyruvate has an option to either turn into lactate or move into the Krebs cycle. But before that, we also have the electron transport chain or chain transport in the middle. So what I'm hoping you're getting a sense of, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but a little bit later, but how much energy comes out of this system is going to be a little bit more than what we got out of the phosphagen system. So let's look at this. So the result of glycolysis At the very bottom of that chemical reaction is pyruvate. Pyruvate can move into two ways. It can either be converted into lactate. We'll talk about that in a minute. Hold on. Don't start talking about lactic acid because you're probably going to get it wrong. So ATP resynthesis occurs at a faster rate, but is limited in duration. So you get a little bit more speed with pyruvate. The process is sometimes called anaerobic glycolysis or fast glycolysis. Anaerobic means without oxygen. And that's going on the lactate side. And then we also have pyruvate could be shuttled into the mitochondria and it'll go into what's called the Krebs cycle. So when it's moved into mitochondria as part of the Krebs cycle, the ATP resynthesis rate is slower, but it can occur for a longer duration if the exercise intensity is low enough. So at this point, you've probably slowed down, let's say that sprint for sure. It's not a full jog yet, but you're slower than a sprint, probably a little faster than the jog. This process is often referred to aerobic glycolysis or slow glycolysis because now you're actually having to use some oxygen as you're starting to shift gears right into the aerobic or what's called the oxidative energy system. But let's talk a little bit more about this thing called lactate. So glycolysis, one of the energy systems, it breaks things down into lactate, or the glycolysis can break chemical reactions can lead to lactate, and it's catalyzed by an enzyme called lactate dehydrogenase. So catalyzed means it's utilized, it's broken further down. The end result, however, is not lactic acid. I know many of you are saying, "Oh, that's lactic acid." No, lactate is not the cause of fatigue. And you can see here the chemical reaction. It is what it is. It requires a couple of phosphates, a little bit of ADP, obviously, 2 lactate plus 2 ATP in water and glucose. Now, let's look here on the right. Lactate buildup, if excessive, can lead to lactic acid accumulation, potentially causing symptoms like muscle fatigue and pain. While lactate itself isn't the primary cause of post-exercise soreness, its buildup can contribute to the burning sensation during intense activity. In some cases, extreme lactate buildup can lead to a serious condition called lactic acidosis. So, we'll look at this in a minute, but your blood has a certain pH acidity level, right? So, as you do more exercise, depending on how in shape you are, if you're not great in shape, if you're not in good shape, what will happen is your bloodstream starts to become a little bit more acidic in nature. That contributes to you stopping. Soreness, accumulation of soreness that can be in the session, right? You start to feel like, oh, that burns. That could be part of some of the side effect of your bloodstream turning a little acidic. But it's not lactic acid per se. Lactic acidosis, though, would be like you're going to stop big time. You're going to probably feel sick. You're going to throw up because your bloodstream is too acidic at that point. So you're like, oh, it's burning, it's lactic acid. No, not really. It's accumulation of some breakdown, but it's not full-blown lactic acid. Now, we have one other factor here. Lactate can be transported in the blood through the liver where it's converted back into glucose. This process is referred to as what's called the Cori cycle. So it's a little side cycle, and you can take lactate, absorb it into your liver, and it can be utilized as glucose. And we do have stores of glucose and glucagon, which is stored inside of the liver itself. And it can be used in an emergency as well. So they can be excreted out in a state of fight or flight. If you're running, sprinting, etc., glucose can be pushed out into the bloodstream to help give you higher concentrations of glucose in your bloodstream, so that glycolysis can happen in the event that you need to you need that energy system. So we've got our body's really adept at kind of keeping little stores of glucose in different organs and different structures, but eventually it's finite, right? It's going to run out. Now, the one last cycle that we need to talk about is the Krebs cycle, and pyruvate that enters into the muscle mitochondria is going to be converted into acetyl-CoA, coenzyme A. Acetyl coenzyme A can either enter the Krebs cycle, can enter the Krebs cycle, and then nicotine, adenosine, di something or other, hydrogenase, I can't remember that one, Molecules enter the electron train. Excuse me. I always mispronounce this. Electron transport system, where they can also be used to resynthesize into ATP. So this is a whole nother system, and you can see the chain there. What happens? And again, I don't get overwhelmed with all of the chemical reactions. These are things that happen. But understand that we really have three ways that we can get energy out of glucose. Vis-a-vis this pyruvate through lactate. The Cori cycle gives us potentially the utilization of glucose later on, and then the Krebs cycle itself. All right, so the energy yield from glycolysis. Glycolysis from one molecule of blood glucose yields a net of 2 ATP molecules. Glycolysis from muscle glycogen yields a net of 3 ATP. So now instead of the 1-for-1 ATP that we got in phosphagen or the phosphate system, we're now getting 1-to-2 and or 1-to-3. So we're getting more energy out of this system. It's a little bit more efficient and not nearly as efficient as the oxidative system that we'll get into here shortly. However, it has limits, right? So stimulated by high concentrations of adenosine diphosphate and phosphate and ammonia, right? So ammonia can be alkaline in nature, and by a slight decrease in pH, acidic in nature. So pH, the lower it is, the more acidic, the higher it is, the more alkaline it is. And adenosine monophosphates. So the more monophosphates you have in your blood, your body's going to start going, hey, something's not right here. We can't keep going. We're going to have to slow down and use another energy system. Inhibited by marked or markedly lower pH, right? So the acidity is going to be more acidic. We're going to get a little bit more acid in the bloodstream. ATP, CP, citrate, and free fatty acids are also going to be signaling to the body that we're going to have to slow down and move into another energy system because we can't reconstitute ATP fast enough. And then we have this also affected by hexokinase, which is going to be an enzyme, phosphofructokinase, and pyruvate kinase. So all of those inases are going to be enzymatic actions that are either not working as optimally as they can. And I want you to think of soil because this concept of limitations to a system is very easily explained. I think conceptually, soil. Like if you keep putting the same plants in soil, what's going to happen to the soil? The soil is going to lose its ability to produce because it doesn't have some of the raw ingredients that the plant needs to grow because you're draining it out. And that's why we typically see rotation of crops. If you're not familiar with farming, you can't put the same crops in the same field or you will strip out essential ingredients, essential minerals that essentially food that the plant needs to grow along with sunlight, obviously. But if you rotate the crops and you put in other crops that use other things out of the soil and replace that allow the soil to replace some of the other things in it, you get a better, what we call undisturbed soil. It's going to be a better structural soil because it's going to have the raw ingredients. Now, that's a long-term process, but you have to think about in the same way this glycolytic system and the oxidative system, which we'll get to. It's going to have certain requirements in the bloodstream from a chemical perspective, from an enzymatic perspective, and from an ATP, ADP, AMP perspective that are going to predetermine the length at which you can do it. And even if you're in the best shape in the world, you will have a finite amount of ability to do this. It will not allow you to do it forever. Now, as you get in better shape, yes, you can do it for longer, but you can't do it longer than the limitations of the system that, and this is why we have 3 different energy systems because it gives us options as we're kind of, unless we're in an emergency situation, that's where adrenaline kicks in and everything's supercharged. But the reality is we've got this limitation based on the availability of what we call substrates. The chemicals, the enzymes, the available ATP, the available glucose, all this stuff has to be in play, including all of those other chemical markers. Otherwise, we just simply can't sustain the intensity that we're currently moving in or operating in from an exercise perspective. All right, so next, glycolysis, lactate threshold, and onset of blood lactate. So now we're talking a little bit more about how we can't sustain this. So that lactate threshold represents an increase reliance on anaerobic mechanisms, right? Anaerobic being without oxygen. Lactate threshold is often used as a marker for anaerobic threshold. So we can actually see in the bloodstream when someone hits a certain threshold of acidity in their blood, they have breached what's called their lactate threshold. So think of it here. If you go past your lactate threshold, what's going to happen is your blood's going to become more acidic, and your body can no longer reconstitute and replenish to pull back acidity out of that, and you will be at your lactate threshold and you will not be able to sustain that for much longer. If you do, you will throw up. It's essentially what it comes down to. You're going to get nauseous, you're going to throw up. Some of you might be out there saying, I've done that before. Yes, we've probably all done that with exercise. Yeah, you can make yourself throw up. Breaching your lactate threshold, especially when you're deconditioned, is not very difficult to do because you're in worse shape, it's lower. But as you start to work out, what happens? You push the envelope, you're going to come up much closer to your lactate threshold, and your body's going to adapt. You're going to come up close again, you're going to push harder, your body's going to adapt. So you could increase your body's ability to tolerate the acidity and be able to reconstitute all of those chemicals and enzymatic actions and things that we just described can be improved upon through training, consistent training, and getting better. And again, we get into that lactate buildup perspective. So once you breach your lactate threshold, you're going to have to stop your exercise. Otherwise, you're going to get nauseous and not be able to continue. So what do? Lower your intensity. Just come on down. Go slower. Some people, I've had clients in the past that early on in their training sessions, I say, hey, once we hit that point when you start to feel a little queasy or uncomfortable, session's over. We went a little too far, but if I continue to push you, you will throw up. And from a client perspective, I don't ever want my client to throw up. Actually, making a client throw up is very easy. Just do 100 burpees or whatever you want to do, something really hard and fast. That'll make you throw up because you don't have the tolerance for that exercise intensity. Part of it being your lactate threshold. It's just not high enough to tolerate the acidity of your bloodstream at that point. So job is, if you get there early on in your training, just relax, come down. One of the things I would always do is put clients, and it was very rare that this would happen. I actually had a trainer that I worked with. I hired, he was a good kid, but he was a bad trainer, I'm going to be honest. And he comes into my office like, oh man, my client, that new client I had, she's throwing up. I said, what are you doing? Let me see your program. I'm looking at his program. It's all like super hard and stuff. Like, what are you doing? This is way too hard for her. So then I said, you got a new client. Let's not make them throw up. And so I look at the program. It's pretty vanilla. And then 30 minutes into the session, oh no, I made this one throw up. And like the kid could not I was like, what are you doing? Your program is like one set of, what are you doing? He's like, I don't know. I don't think you give him enough rest. I'm like, obviously you didn't give him enough rest. So this is the life of when I he meant well, but that didn't really last for him. Let's just leave it at that. As a coach, as a trainer, if you're training yourself, you've got to be really mindful. Couple signs that you'll see if someone actually isn't feeling particularly good, and if we've all been there, it's the same like if we're feeling sick. Your skin tone might change. It's called pallor. You might feel lightheaded. You might obviously feel queasy. You look clammy or feel clammy and become maybe very pale, uncomfortable. And best thing to do is sit down. The other thing that I would have people do is just sit on the bike, on the recumbent bike, the seated bike, and just move their feet slowly. Because what you're doing is you're slow respiration. So the heart is, you're not beating hard, but you're getting blood flow happening. So the body can reconstitute all the enzymatic actions, and the acidity can rise or get better, and turn more basic. So let's look at this for a second, because you see here blood pH levels with that lactate threshold. So really our blood is a little bit more acidic, a little bit more basic. It's more on the basic side. And you're going to see it's around that green range, 735, just above 7 to 745. If you move over to further to the right, it's going to be more alkaline or a base. If you remember chemistry, if you don't, I don't know what to tell you. LAUSD has failed you. I apologize for that, but it is what it is. So basic is over to the right, acidic is over to the left. But either side we go is death. You can see that. So we don't want our blood stream becoming too acidic or too basic. Acidic, if we get more acidic, because what happens, right, we're a little more basic, and when we exercise, bloodstream gets a little bit more acidic. And so that's what makes people get a little nauseous, and that's usually how you'll self-select out if you've gone too hard. If you're able to push through that, that's where we start to run into problems, and that's where we run into situations of a rapid muscle breakdown, things like rhabdomyolysis, and people can kill you. So it's hard to kill someone with exercise. It is possible, but someone usually will self-select out and just pass out, or just be like, I'm done, I can't do anymore. Certainly, most people will not continue to exercise when they're throwing up. That's not a fun experience. But we generally see, just good idea to understand that we are a little bit more basic. Now, what's interesting is you might have seen this out in the industry, alkaline water. You'll see that. Does it help? Sure, you're putting a little bit more base in your body if your bloodstream is becoming a little bit more acidic from working out. All right, you're getting a little bit more base into your bloodstream. Might help. I haven't seen a lot of research on it, so I can't say yes definitively that does this XYZ. Could potentially help. The water tastes interesting, right? Tastes a little bit different. But ultimately, your body's going to recalibrate its own pH depending on what you do with your exercise or your water. All right. So lactate threshold. So this is a kind of a good visual to kind of talk about where does the lactate threshold and then what's called onset blood lactate accumulation. Once you reach your lactate threshold, the onset of what's called blood lactate accumulation, meaning your blood now is going to have more acidity in it, and you cannot get rid of that. So you see the heart rate is going to be in blue. It's going up pretty diagonally, right? And then you see watts, energy output, and then blood lactate on the left side. So obviously lactate's going to be in purple, and you're going to see this breach for this particular person. It's their max heart rate, their lactate threshold, right around where those two lines cross is the onset of blood lactate accumulation. Actually, sorry, it's below that, right? But at that point, if you keep going, you're going to breach that. It's going to become very, very uncomfortable. You're going to see the lactate threshold is going to be a little bit lower, and it's about point just above 2, where you start to see lactate starting to ramp up. And if you are not careful at this point, it's just going to continue to go vertically, and then eventually you're just going to have to stop working out. So what happens? Lactate threshold begins at around 50% to 60% of maximal oxygen uptake in untrained individuals, and about 70 to 80% in aerobically trained individuals. So you improve your lactate threshold as you get into better cardiovascular shape. The OBLA happens, the onset of blood lactate happens in a second increase in the rate of lactate accumulation. It occurs at a higher relative intensities in exercise. So if you push harder, you're going to go into OBLA more quickly. And it occurs when concentrations of blood lactate reach 4 millimeters moles per millimeters of, I should know this, mmol, millimeters of something per liter of blood. So you're going to see this right up here. If you look across at where's 4, right there. If you look on the left-hand side, once you breach 4, you've actually you've started to accumulate lactate at a much faster rate. You can kind of see the line starts to go more vertical more quickly. And if you continue exercising, you're going to start to feel uncomfortably sick. All right. Then we have the final system, the third system, which is bang for buck. The most amount of ATP we get out of that is going to be the oxidative aerobic system. That's the green line. And it's going to be the primary source of ATP at rest and during low intensity activities. So it uses primarily carbohydrates and fats for the energy to build, to basically get energy out of. That's what that substrate is. All right, so at the tail end of glucose and glycogen oxidation, where we're starting to breathe a little heavier, metabolism of blood glucose and muscle glycogen begins with glycolysis and leads into that Krebs cycle. So now we're going into the mitochondria, which, if you remember, is the power plant of the cell. The NADH and the FADH2 molecules transport hydrogen atoms into the electron train transport, where the ATP is produced from the ADP at a higher rate. This is that Krebs cycle at a more advanced, deeper dive. There is a bunch of enzymatic action happening here. I'm not going to get into all this, but it is literally a cycle that will keep rotating and keep producing ATP, assuming you have enough carbohydrates in the system and in fat. So moving on, this is going to be the electron chain transport. It's coenzyme Q and cytochrome. These are, again, other functions. And you can see that ATP and ADP come out of those chemical reactions, and it looks like a chain. That's why it's called the electron transport chain. Now, fat oxidation, triglycerides. So triglycerides are just fat in blood. They're stored in fat cells and can be broken down by hormone-sensitive lipase, which is an enzyme. This releases free fatty acids from the fat cells in the blood, where they can circulate and enter muscle fibers. So this little visual here is like, what would your body prefer? We would prefer fat. If we can get energy from fat, it's much more productive than it is for sugars. But if we start increasing our intensity a little bit more, we're going to kind of dip into sugar. And if we slow down, we're going to kind of get a little bit more fat. Continuing on with that. So some free fatty acids come from intramuscular sources. So if you ever look at, let's take a piece of steak for an example, you'll notice that there's marbling in there. There's fat inside of muscles. And free fatty acids enter the mitochondria, are broken down and form acetyl-CoA, coenzyme A, and hydrogen protons. The acetyl-CoA enters the Krebs cycle, and then the hydrogen atoms are carried by the NADH and FADH2 to the electron chain transport. So we've got multiple things happening here. And that's a good thing, because we're going to get a lot more energy out of this. So you see on the right side, upper right side, fatty acids. On the lower portion, you see amino acids. And on the upper left-hand side, you see a little bit more protein oxidation. So amino acids coming from protein oxidation. Anytime you see oxidation, it's going to be oxygen utilized with whatever substrate. So in that case, it's going to be amino acids, which is protein. And on the right-hand side, you're going to see that beta oxidation, and that means it's going to be coming from fat. So protein oxidation. Protein is not a significant source of energy for most activities. However, it's broken down into amino acids, and the amino acids are converted into glucose, pyruvate, and various Krebs cycle intermediates to produce ATP. So we can use it. It's not the ideal scenario, and certainly if we're starving or we're in a state of a significant amount of stress, we will absolutely use protein to convert that into energy through the oxidative system. So what's going to kind of limit the oxidative system? There's going to be a bunch of enzymes. Obviously, ADP, right, adenosine diphosphate. If it can't reconstitute an ATP, it's going to accumulate. That's going to be a problem. The rate of the Krebs cycle is going to be reduced if NAD plus and FAD2 plus are not available in sufficient quantities to accept the hydrogen. So, of course, all of this chemical reaction happening. And the electron chain transport is stimulated by ADP and inhibited by ATP. So if you have enough ATP in the blood, you don't need to be in the electron chain transport. The system's looking for more ADP, and then it wants to kick in to actually create more phosphate to turn more ADP back in, combining ADP with a phosphate to turn it back into ATP. The key point here is that the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, that's the same thing. They don't necessarily have a single universally agreed upon rate limiting step like some of the other metabolic pathways. Instead, its overall rate is controlled primarily by the activity of three key enzymes that catalyze irreversible reactions. So the citrate synthase, isotrate dehydrogenase, and alpha key glutarate dehydrogenase complex. So all of these things are happening at once. And if they start to, if one of them starts to kick in, it becomes problematic for the other systems. And so it's a combination of all three that sort of dictate this. It's not one specific thing like in the phosphagen system. Okay. Metabolism fat. So one thing to think about: fat, carbs, and protein are macronutrients. The metabolism fat and that of carbohydrate and protein share some common pathways. Note that all are reduced to acetyl coenzyme A and enter the Krebs cycle. In general, there is an inverse relationship between the given energy system's maximum rate of ATP production, example is ATP produced per unit of time, and the total amount of ATP it can produce over time. So inverse relationship between the energy system's maximum rate of ATP, right? If it can produce more ATP, and we'll look at this in a second, it takes longer to do it. If it can produce a low amount of ATP, it will be fast. And so if we look at, and then there's going to be a middle level. So duration of event on the left side, intensity of event in the middle, and primary energy system use. So 0 to 6 seconds, extremely intense phosphagen. 60 to 30 seconds, intensity is going to be a little bit less at very high, and you're going to use phosphagen system in fast glycolysis. 30 to 2 minutes, all fast glycolysis. 2 to 3 minutes, it's going to be moderate intensity, so you're slowing down for sure. Fast glycolysis and oxidative system, and then greater than 3 minutes, intensity is going to be very low. Think like a long cardio jog. All oxidative systems. So the relationship between duration, intensity, and primary energy systems used assume that the athlete strives to attain the best possible performance for a given event, assuming that you're working as hard as you can. All right, ranking the amount of ATP, the rate and capacity of ATP. So you look at the phosphagen system. The rate of ATP it produces is a 1-to-1. The capacity of the APT produced is 5. Fast glycolysis, the rate of ATP it can get you is you can get 2 ATP out of that, with the capacity being 4. Slow glycolysis, so now we're using a little bit more oxygen, starting to breathe a little bit more, or we're at fast intensity, not super fast, medium to fast. We're going to get 3 ATP. The capacity of APT produces 3. Now we move to the oxidation of carbohydrates first, and then we get oxidation of fats and protein. We get 4 ATP with the capacity of ATP being 2. And then 5 for the last one in the oxidative system, with the capacity being of ATP production being 1. Note that 1 is fastest, greatest, 5 is slowest, least. Key point here is the extent at which each of the 3 energy systems contributes to ATP production depends primarily on the intensity of muscular activity and secondarily on the duration. At no time during either exercise or rest does any single energy system provide the complete supply of energy. So the harder you work, the more you'll use the phosphagen, but you can't sustain that forever. So you'll move back down into glycolysis, and then if you really slow down, you're going to be in oxidative. But then you might need to sprint up again, and maybe you'll use fast glycolysis. Maybe you don't go full bore in phosphagen. So think about a soccer match. Soccer match is probably the best because it's constantly going, right? The ball stops only when you're throwing it in and kind of cards or whatever is going on. But the players are running. Sometimes they're sprinting. Sometimes they're jogging. So there's this constant dynamic of oxidative glycolysis and phosphagen are all happening at once. They can't all happen. You can't sprint the whole entire time. But that's typically why you're going to pass the ball. And usually the bang, bang plays are going to be bang, 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 goal, right? When it really, really happens. If you're jogging with the ball, that means that you're probably playing a little bit more possession, a little bit more defense, but you're not super sprinting, but you might sprint, pull back, sprint, pull back. And you're able to kind of move in and out of these energy systems depending on the demand. And ultimately comes down to your overall conditioning, right? Obviously soccer, you got to be really good at running, but you're constantly going in and out of these energy systems all throughout the game. So it's going to behoove you to train all of these energy systems when you're in your preparing for your season. All right, so let's move on now. Substrate depletion and repletion. So losing what is preventing you from maintaining your ability to stay in an energy system, and then repletion is going to be what is being put back in order for me to be able to utilize that energy system again. So in the phosphagen system, the creatine phosphate can decrease markedly 50 to 70% during the first stage, 50 to 30 seconds of high intensity exercise, and can be almost eliminated because of very intense exercise exhaustion. So look at where ATPPC, the red line, drops out right at 15%. And then at 30 seconds, I mean, it's barely in the background. There's just no way you can sustain that full volition effort. So phosphagen repletion can occur in a relatively short period of time. Complete resynthesis of ATP appears to occur within 3 to 5 minutes, and complete creatine phosphate resynthesis can occur within 8 minutes. So we get a big chunk of it, 3 to 5 minutes, but by 8 minutes, we've got that whole thing really, really filled back up. So we could then probably sprint at least for another 15 seconds, full volition, full effort, maybe a little bit longer if we're in better shape. Now, glycogen the depletion is related to the exercise intensity because you got slow and fast glycolysis. So relative intensities of exercise above 60% of maximum oxygen uptake, muscle glycogen becomes an increasingly important energy substrate. So again, the glucose that's stored in your muscles becomes really, really important. The entire glycogen content of some muscle cells can become depleted during exercise, however. So in some cases, if you look here in the diagram, we have muscle glycogen is going to be, look on the right-hand side. In skeletal muscles, glycogen provides energy to support physical activity, particularly during high-intensity exercise and explosive movements. But we also have glycogen in our liver. Glycogen stored in the liver helps to maintain sugar-dependent functions throughout the body, including stabilizing blood sugar levels. So it might, if we're using our blood sugar levels, if we're not able to, because we're going to use some of the glucose in our bloodstream for sure, liver is going to put that glycogen back in, or sometimes called glucagon, to put it back into the bloodstream to help keep us stabilized there. All right, continue on glycogen. Repletion of muscle glycogen during recovery is related to post-exercise carbohydrate ingestion. Aha! Carbohydrate ingestion post-exercise. Repletion appears to be optimal at 0.7 to 3 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight, and is ingested every 2 hours following exercise. Now, so how do we figure this out? What do we need? 2.2 pounds per kilogram. There's 2.2 pounds in a kilogram. So divide your body weight by 2.2 and you'll have your weight in kilograms. Multiply your body weight in kilograms by 0.7 to 3 to figure out what your carbohydrate replacement strategy is. Typically, when we post-workout with resistance training in particular, we want a 4-to-1 ratio of simple carbs to protein. Post-resistance, you want more carbohydrates in simple carbs. Something that's sugary is better. Something that's ultimately glucose-based would be ideal, but it's hard to get glucose. So something that's pretty simple sugar, like a candy bar, is the perfect time to eat, is the perfect thing to have post-workout. Some of you are like, yes, I can eat candy. Yeah, I mean, if you're going to have it post-workout, it's better than nothing. But you'd also want some protein with it. So one of the things that I always, this has been out for quite some time, but skim chocolate milk is got the perfect ratio of carbs to protein because it's in no fat. Fat will get impede this. So I know we're seeing that little balancing act with fat in purple. You don't want any fat post-workout. You don't want any fat pre-workout either, because that will require a lot more digestion and can sometimes make upset people's stomachs. So if you're going to have a pre-workout meal, you want something that's carbohydrate-based. Maybe a little bit of protein, but primarily carbohydrate-based. And then post-workout, you're going to want to have a 4-to-1 ratio of carbs to protein. And simple carbs. Simple. So make it simple. Something sweet is totally fine. All right, so ranking of bioenergetic limiting factors. So if we look at this, it's just random kind of Olympic-oriented events. You're going to see the ATP In the first column, the muscle glycogen. In the second column, liver glycogen. In the third column, fat stores. And then lower pH, so more acidity in the bloodstream. And you can kind of see on the left-hand side a marathon, what you're going to be using. And then note that 1 is the least probable limiting factor, 5 is the most probable limiting factor. So ATP from the creatine phosphate phosphagen system isn't going to be an issue when you're just running a marathon because you're not sprinting. Although some of those Kenyan guys sprint really, really fast, but they're trained. That's their endurance, just to be super fast. But you see the rate limiting step is going to be somewhere muscle glycogen, maybe liver glycogen. If you look at a triathlon, so now you're doing 3 events, you're doing the run, swim, and bike, muscle glycogen, liver glycogen. Kind of moving along, you can kind of see where everything is. Let's go to the bottom, repeated snatch, Olympic snatch. That's where the barbell's going up over your head. It's hard to see, but up over your head like this. The ATP system now is going to be the one, the phosphagen system is going to be the one that's going to be the biggest rate limiting step in muscle glycogen. And then we have to deal with it. Significant acidity could be an issue too if we don't get enough recovery in between. That's why Olympic weightlifters, they do 3 trials and that's it. And they get, multiple minutes between each of those because they want to be able to allow them to reconstitute their APT concentrations and make sure their their blood acidity is normalized. All right, so low intensity steady state exercise. So 75% of your maximum oxygen uptake is going to be or lower. There's this other thing called EPOC, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So when you exercise at a certain level, you're going to have an oxygen debt that your tissues are going to want to have more oxygen put back in, which comes from elevated respiration, which is an interesting thing as we start to talk about high intensity interval training, why that's effective from a weight loss perspective, more so than just steady state, lower intensity cardio. And then we have VO2 is going to be your maximum oxygen uptake, your ability to how effective are you at using oxygen. So if we look over here, this EPOC, which stands for excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, and it's oxygen uptake above resting values used to restore the body to pre-existing condition, also called post-exercise oxygen uptake, oxygen debt, or recovery oxygen. And you're going to see here, so let's look at this for a second. So you exercise in that big rectangle, so you're at rest over there on the left, then you start to exercise for 15 minutes. If you stay at a steady state and you continue on there, you're going to see that you're going to have some VO2 requirements in that dotted line at the top. You have this debt, that meaning you're tapping into your tissues and you need to use more oxygen to replenish the oxidative processes that have happened in those tissues. But what you see is that kind of diagonal. Once you stop, you still have O2 exchange happening. And that's why you see greater respiration post-workout. Now, the more rigorous the workout, the more EPOC you're going to have to repay back. And that means you're going to have an elevated metabolism. We can see in resistance training as an example, if you do a heavy resistance training, let's say you do, I don't want to say like a circuit. I want you to think about like maximum effort stuff. 5 reps, you're going to do 5 reps of squats where by the time you get to the 5th rep, you're like, it's like hard as hell, right? You're having difficulty moving it. You do bench press, you do weighted pull-ups if you're strong enough. After doing that and then taking your rest for 2 minutes or whatever, and then doing multiple sets of that, you're going to be toast. And your oxygen debt is going to pay dividends, not only because of just the respiration aspect of it, because you've done a little bit of a circuit with heavy weights, you also have to replenish and repair the tissue, which means you're going to have an elevated metabolism in the scientific literature for up to 72 hours. So resistance training in a circuit fashion can be really, really powerful, assuming the loading is significant enough, because you get increased caloric expenditure because of this EPOC. And because the tissues themselves have to repair themselves, which can be, having an elevated metabolism post workout for 70, basically 3 days after your workout is fantastic. You're building strength, you're building cardiovascular conditioning, and you're enhancing your metabolism. Now, if we look at high intensity, non steady state exercise, it's going to be 80% maximum power output or greater. The required VO2, how much oxygen you use, is going to, the required VO2 here is the oxygen uptake that would be required to sustain the exercise in such an uptake were possible to attain. So, can you sustain 80% maximum effort or greater? Because it is not possible, the oxygen deficit lasts for the duration of the exercise. So, when you work harder, you're going to have to pay a greater oxygen debt. Now, this is something that we talk about high intensity interval training, and I want to point out that term. You see this guy on the left here, Dr. Izumi Tabata. How many of you have heard of a Tabata before? Maybe you've heard of a class called Tabata, where it's basically an high intensity interval program. Well, Dr. Tabata is an exercise physiologist from Japan. He was the first person to document in the exercise science literature in the mid 90s that if you did high intensity exercise, you could actually not only enhance your VO2 max, your ability to maximally utilize oxygen, increase your overall conditioning, but you could also increase your fat loss. So the protocol itself, the Tabata protocol, we'll talk about this in a second when we talk about setting up intervals, was created by Dr. Tabata. Basically because he started looking at, and he did a cycling, like this guy's doing, he did a cycling with Japanese sprinters, ice skating sprinters. And he did 2 days of what he called the Tabata protocol. And he was able to really enhance their VO2 max, and they also were lost body fat, which is pretty cool. All right, so time breakdown of energy systems utilizing via maximal bicycle ergometry. So that's what that guy was doing. You're going to see exercise intensity of 100% maximum power output. You're going to see 100% first 5 seconds. Contributions of the anaerobic system. So think the phosphagen system predominantly. It's going to be 96. As we get up to 30% at 75, 60 seconds it's 50, 90 seconds it's 35, 150 seconds it's 30, and it just goes down and down and down. And then the contributions of the aerobic system, so the slow glycolysis and then into the oxidative system, you're going to see it starts to ramp up. So they're inversely related. All right. So what does this all mean? The key point here is the use of appropriate exercise intensities and rest intervals allows for the selection of specific energy systems during training and results in more efficient and productive regimens for specific athletic events with various metabolic demands. So we can actually train the energy systems, and it requires you to stay within the windows with the defined thresholds of each of those energy systems. And we can see this, that sometimes athletes have poor glycolysis development. And while they can sprint and they can do endurance stuff, they sort of run out of the ability. This looks like the person that just can't get the energy up to run, to sprint later in the game. So we would want to look at their glycolytic system, and we would potentially want to enhance that by training them within the confines of that glycolytic system. They can't sprint maximally, but they have to go faster than the steady state interval. And we can look at VO2 max, we can look at heart rate, and we can actually define that a little bit more effectively for athletes depending on the conditioning that they're in. Interval training. So that concept of, doing some high intensity stuff followed by some lower intensity stuff. It emphasizes bioenergetic adaptation for more efficient energy transfer within the metabolic pathways by using predetermined intervals and exercise and rest periods. Much more training can be accomplished at higher intensities if you are not going high all the time. So basically, I'm going to go high for 30 seconds. I'm going to rest for 30 seconds. You can do harder work and bang for buck if we're talking about getting minimum exercise requirements. 75 minutes of higher intensity exercise is going to be more effective. It's a shorter duration, equals what you would need. We haven't really talked about it in this course, but you need about 150 minutes of moderate physical activity daily, per week, to prevent long-term chronic illness. But if you do 75 minutes of higher intensity work, so think of an interval, you can get the same benefits of 150 in a shorter amount of time. Difficult to establish definitive guidelines for choosing specific work to rest ratios, though. So we'll give some ideas here. If you want to train the phosphagen system, it'll be maximum 90 to 100% effort. 5 to 10 seconds is how you would want to train it. The range of work to rest ratios might be 1 to 12. Work one. So if you say I'm gonna work for 5 seconds, I'm gonna rest for 50 seconds, right? 1 to 10, up to 1 to 20. So if I was going to do 5 seconds on, multiply 5 times 20, that's what, 100? Yeah, so you're talking about a minute and a half almost. If you want to train the fast glycolysis, the typical exercise time is going to be 15 to 30 seconds, and you're going to have a work to rest ratio period of 1 to 3 to 1 to 5. Fast glycolysis, oxidative, 1 to 3 minutes, 1 to 3 or 1 to 4. And then the oxidative system is going to be a little bit closer, like a 1 to 1. It's going to be greater. So your work to rest is going to be equal 1 to 1, or you're going to get 1 to 3. So that high intensity interval training, the HIIT stuff, brief repeated bouts of high intensity exercise with intermittent recovery periods to elicit cardiopulmonary, metabolic, and neuromuscular adaptations. Cumulative duration and intensity of active portions should equate to several minutes above 90% VO2 max. So you got to really work hard for several minutes in total. You know, again, you're going to probably be doing 30 seconds, 20 seconds, 15 seconds, but cumulatively you want that full out effort as you do multiple rounds of this, including your rest period. You want it to accumulate over multiple minutes. So the suggested work to rest ratios are going to be greater than 1 to 1. So what does that mean? When using in conjunction with other training sessions, it may result in greater stress and risk of injury. So you have to be mindful, right? You're going to be working to exhaustion. It's going to be harder for you to have good form and good technique. So where do you start? Maybe you start at a 4 to 1 of, well, that should be the other way. We'll say that rest to work. So 4 rest, 1 work. So think about whatever you want to do. I want to do 10 work. That would be 40 seconds of rest. A 3 to 1 would be 10 seconds of work, 30 seconds of rest. 2 to 1. And then 1 to 1 would be equal amounts. So I'm gonna sprint for 30, I'm gonna rest for 30. Now, if we go the other way and we say, all right, I'm going to rest for 30, or 1 to 2, work to, should be really, I have this backwards, rest to work, 1 part rest, 2 parts work. So now I'm going into negative rest. So like 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off. And there's Dr. Tabata again laughing at us, because that is the exact Tabata protocol for 4 minutes. So 4 or 8, I can't remember. But basically his protocol was 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off for 4 minutes. I think it was 8 rounds. So for 4 minutes. 20 seconds on, full volition, as hard as humanly possible. So think of those battle ropes just going, 10 seconds off. You're not going to fully recover, are you? So by the time you get into the second, third, fourth, fifth round, the 8th round, you're utterly exhausted. And that is the true Tabata protocol. Now, combination training is going to be adding aerobic endurance training to the training of an anaerobic athletes in order to enhance the recovery, because recovery relies primarily on aerobic mechanisms. So it may reduce anaerobic performance capabilities, particularly high strength, high power performance. So remember that this concept of getting what we train for, if we want to be maximally strong, we have to train for just strength. If you start adding a cardiovascular component into your strength training, you're not going to be maximally strong, because you're going to have competing structural changes in the muscles themselves. And so I put this slide in here so you could kind of see what that looks like. On the right side, you have some myofibrils, and that's going to be, those vertical lines are going to be cross-sectional protein fibers, and that's what we haven't really got into the sliding filament theory, which we'll get into here at some point. But that is what your muscle looks like when you're very, very strong. And on the left, you're going to see those big circles. That's mitochondria. So when you have more oxidative capacity, when you do more endurance work, you're going to have more mitochondria than you're going to have more cross-sectional protein fibers. We didn't get in, when we do muscle, we'll look at some muscle stuff. There's different muscle fiber types. And depending on what activity you do, you might have more mitochondria. If you're doing more endurance work, if you're doing some cross training, you might have the best of both worlds. If you're doing full powerlifting or just full strongman stuff, you're going to look more like on the right hand side. Now there's mitochondria in there; they're in there, but there's just more contractile protein. So if you try and get the power lifter to go jog for an hour, that's going to be really hard. Equally, if you try and get the endurance runner to lift, 2.5 times their body weight in any one lift, they're going to be crushed. So there's this you get what you train for dynamic always in play. We can never have maximal anything because we would run out of room. We can never have maximal all things. We'll either be equally, have good cardio, or let's just say decent cardio, decent strength. But if I focus more on cardio, I can really increase my cardio capacity, but my strength capacity is going to go down. If I increase my strength capacity, maximum capacity, or my muscle size, right, that can potentially get in the way of having mitochondria. So it's what do you want to train for, and then how do we get you there based on the stimulation vis-a-vis the exercise. All right, that was pretty long. I don't even know how long this thing is. 76 minutes. But good. You might have some questions. I'm going to put up in the discussion board any questions on Exercise Phys. I'll get in there and I'll try and answer them. At least, excuse me, not on Exercise Phys, but on the Bioenergetics. I hope you found this interesting. It was a lot of fun for me to put together. It does take me quite some time to put these together. So I appreciate your patience with me. And again, I'll put up a discussion board asking any questions. But let's keep it general to Exercise Phys. Let's not get into personal stuff because it's just too difficult to do that. And I'll put those instructions up as well. All right. Talk to you soon.